right, welcome everybody. We are here with Dr. Nick Brown. So today we're probably going to be talking about issues like data fabrication and meta science and replication issues, and basically issues in psychological research. So Nick, would you be able to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about who you are and what kind of work you do?
Thanks. Well, I'm British. I have an Irish passport now, courtesy of Brexit. I live in Spain. Yeah, I have a PhD in health psychology, but I only entered the world of science in 2011 at the age of 50 when I did a master's in psychology. Before that, I was an IT professional, and I've been retired since 2012, and my retirement hobby is initially kind of critiquing poor psychology at the level of psychology, but increasingly I find myself researching into fraud and data fabrication and in psychology and also in science more widely. So looking into data sets, finding patterns that aren't plausible, and helping other people who are looking for that, and giving advice on how to or whether to pursue these cases and try and get the literature corrected or whatever other result people might be looking for.
So the first thing I'm curious about is how did you get into doing this sort of stuff, like investigating potential cases of data fabrication and spotting potentially bad research and looking into it? Like, what prompted you to start doing this?
Well, already on week 3 of my master's, and if people look for an excellent article that was written about this study by a writer called Vinny Rotondaro on a platform called Narratively, and every so often Narratively refeatures it as one of their articles of the week, even though it was written 10 years ago. Anyway, this article by Vinny Rotondaro entitled "Nick Brown Smelled Bull," and 3 weeks or three weekends into my master's, I came across this paper that we were being taught about that just didn't seem to make any sense. Not in a fraudulent way, just in a sort of bonkers kind of a way. And so I wrote a rebuttal article, and I was extremely lucky to be able to recruit the famous mathematician and debunker of bad ideas generally, Alan Sokal, as one of my co-authors on that article. And so that got quite a buzz. I got into writing other critical articles about certain aspects of psychology, but again within the limits of the field. You know, they would write an article and we would write an article back, pointing out where we thought they were wrong and conceptually. So we were at that level, nothing to really to do with misconduct. I suppose the first contact I had was, there is a Dutch professor of social psychology called Diederik Stapel, and in 2011 he was caught having been fabricating his data for a long time. And during the year that it took between him getting fired and the committee of inquiry, which he to some extent cooperated with, reporting on how this happened and how it could be prevented from happening again, he wrote a sort of confessional autobiography in Dutch, which he published and was immediately pirated and put all over the internet. So people were stopping him profiting from his crime. And I read a review of it, and which said it was quite a good book. And it occurred to me that I have some knowledge of psychology, and one of my lesser known skills is that I'm fluent in Dutch. So I translated the book. I worked with the author to translate that book into English, and we made it available as a free PDF. And so in the book, he explains, perhaps not 100% candidly, but he explains, the pressures and how he went about making up numbers. Not so much about the process of making up the numbers, a lot more to do about the circumstances. And we thought about trying to find a publisher, but in the end, we made it available for free download, and it's still there. And I'll give you the link to put in the titles. And so that was kind of at the back of the mind. And then one day, we were on science Twitter, which I'm sure will be science Bluesky shortly, but science Twitter was a good place to hang around in the mid-2010s. A colleague of, I read about a colleague of mine read it? No, I read about a study that one of the prominent commentators was writing about, a really terrible sort of study that obviously couldn't be true. And I got chatting that evening with a friend of mine over Skype, and we had a look at this paper and we realized that it was so bad that we could reconstruct the entire data set just from the descriptive statistics, because the whole thing was so obviously fake and the numbers were so obviously fraudulent that the values were so extreme that you could reconstruct the entire data set. There was only one set of numbers that would fit it. And then we kind of reversed that principle and discovered that a lot of published articles that we looked at in serious journals proper had numbers that were just impossible. So the means didn't add up, as simple as a mean. So they would report that we had 27 people and they scored an average of 1.02 on some measure from 1 to 2, 1.02 or 1.98, or some number that simply isn't possible when you divide an integer by 27. And we found an enormous number of those. And we wrote this up for an article, and that became known as the Grimm test. And it was quite a hit. It caused quite a stir to discover just how many very elementary level errors at that level there are in the literature. Now, most of those aren't fraudulent, but when we got hold of some of the data sets, several of them were. And we identified probably 3 cases of fraud out of the, how many? About 7, I can't remember the exact number, but like 70 or 80 papers we were able to look at. We ended up with 3 cases that were fairly obviously fraud. So it kind of went from there. And then people started writing. People write to you when you get known for that, or you give a talk and people come up and say thank you or whatever. And then just as you're leaving, there's a phenomenon in therapy called the door handle conversation, where someone is leaving, your 50 minutes of therapy are up and goodbye, see you next week, and you make some small talk, and then as the client gets their hand on the door handle, they say, oh, and by the way, and they drop this bombshell, which for the therapist to kind of mull over for the next week. And so people will come up to you, any questions? Okay, you answer the questions. Okay, fine. Thank you, Dr. Brown. Coming, another round of applause. You start packing up. You put your laser pen in your pocket. And just as you're leaving the room, someone comes up to you when no one else is looking and says, can I have a word with you about, there's some stuff in this paper that I read, but I can't talk to anybody about it, because it's by my supervisor or my ex-supervisor or my ex-boyfriend. And it's, you get a lot of that. A lot of people have a lot of suspicions.
So before, I have a few questions just about data fabrication in general, but I think a lot of people that are watching this might not know exactly what sort of things are data fabrication or what kinds of data fabrication there are, and then how we would distinguish that from other sorts of things. So for instance, there is just straight up sloppy errors and people misusing statistics simply because they're not aware of how to do research properly. Then there's people that, p-hack, in some cases semi-intentionally, really searching to get that significance. And then you have this sort of gray area between that and then people, for instance, like just changing a few numbers to outright fabricating data. So could you cover some of the stuff that is data fabrication or what kinds of data fabrication there are, and then stuff that's not, but is still like questionable or not so great?
I think changing even a few numbers, we're already into. I mean, it's like it's like the difference between kind of being a murderer and being Stalin or something. You're still a murderer, and I think a lot of the advanced hacking, we have to get away from this euphemism of questionable research. We've got the questionable research practices and then the fraud. And I think the main reason we have this section of questionable research practices is they're so prevalent that if we call them fraud, then we'd have to kind of fire an enormous number of people. I think if you've been, we can all accidentally run a study where we collect data and stop and look at the p-value and carry on and, oh, now it's significant. And we can all do that. But when you've been told 3 times that that's, going to generate false positives, you kind of have to stop doing it. And there are people who've made their entire career out of that. But I mean, there's entire studies invented out of whole cloth, which is what Staple often did. So the study never took place. The study only took place in his imagination. But he would then put some numbers together that, when you calculated the means and the standard deviations between the 2 groups, showed that there was an effect. But that, the study had never taken place. A more subtle one is, and which is very hard to detect, is to run the study with people in 2 conditions, and then the people who get the results that are least favorable for your hypothesis. So let's say that you're running a study on a treatment, and it's meant to make people feel better. So the people who are in the control group who didn't get the treatment, the 3 or 4 of those who got better anyway quite a lot, they're going to hurt your result. And then in the treatment group, there's going to be 3 or 4 people who didn't really get better, or maybe even got worse. So what you do is you just swap the groups for those 2. And that will very often give you quite an impressive, significant result. And you don't need to do anything apart from changing the groups. And the nice thing there is that all of the other numbers will appear plausible because it's indistinguishable from the treatment actually working. So that's quite common. That's very common. And those situations are hard to detect unless there's some other data that goes along with the membership of the group that you forget to copy across. That would be a subtle form of data manipulation that's very hard to detect. And then also you can just, if maybe you don't have a control group and a treatment group, you can just boost some of the numbers. You can just add 1, go through in Excel and add 1 to some of the numbers. And that's quite common. But probably the 2 most common are either making up the entire experiment, which I think happens surprisingly often. I know one researcher who I'm convinced has fabricated at least 200 studies. Or if you have a big lab, it's sometimes a bit hard to get away with that. So yeah, just be the first person to get hold of the data set when you download it from the web platform, if it was done on a web platform. Tweak a few of the condition values, and then hand that file on to people and say, hey guys, I got the data downloaded from Qualtrics. I wonder what's in there. And they'll go, gosh, we've got a result. So, the only way to disprove that is to go back to the original data that's on Qualtrics' server. And in order to do that, you've got to launch the kind of investigation that requires the level of suspicion that we don't like to talk about with our colleagues. It is very much kind of, oh my God, is John a werewolf? If what do werewolves do? They eat sheep or whatever it is that werewolves do. This phenomenon is happening, and you're going, well, the only explanation is that Uncle Pete is a werewolf. Uncle Pete, are you a werewolf? And it's not the kind of question you're going to ask. And it's very hard within the confines of a university environment to go and to say, well, Dr. Staple, are you making up your data? It's not the first thing you expect to be asked when you come in on a Monday morning. And it's the fact of asking it. It's not the kind of thing you can kind of ask and then everyone will forget that you asked it.
Yeah, so this is one of the things, you had been on my radar for a while because I contacted you back when I was first a graduate student. This was 5 or 6 years ago, just to say, hey, I love what you're doing, keep doing it. But I was not comfortable at the time openly encouraging the type of data sleuthing that you do, or really being that involved in this sort of stuff. And if I saw suspicious stuff, I don't know if I would have spoken out for these sorts of reasons. I mean, once it's the cat's out of the box type of thing. Once an accusation is out there, there is no taking it back. And that radically changes not just your relationship with the person that you potentially make an accusation of, but the entire academic field. So there is, one of the things that concerns me, and I'd like to get your perspective on this because you have experience with this, is I think it might have been the wise move for me to not be so open in being involved in like whistleblowing and this sort of stuff, because it looks like the people that do this are often on the receiving end of a rather extraordinary degree of backlash or suspicion or hostility themselves. So I want to ask you what your general, I guess a couple questions. How people have reacted to your work, because you've gotten positive reactions from people like myself, and I'm sure you've gotten positive reactions from a lot of other people, but have you had negative reactions? Like, what's the ratio, and what's the severity? Like, do people threaten you or send nasty emails? So there's that. And then, like, I guess just your general perception, not just of your own experiences, but in psychology, how have people generally reacted to people exposing fabrication and the types of things that you've exposed?
I haven't had too much nasty feedback. If I had, I might not be in the business, because I have friends who do this who really don't give a fig, don't give a flying one. And I actually personally don't like, if I send someone I quite often don't even write to authors, because I'm slightly, I don't want to hide behind my fingers when they come back and say, how dare you do this? But actually that very rarely happens. The modal response to any inquiry that I send asking for a data set or asking, how this problem might have come about, is no response at all. Which is already, to me, reasonably solid confirmation that I'm on the right track. I think people probably work out that if they reply angrily, it's probably not going to work out well for them. But I don't have all that much spontaneous contact with people before I blog, and I know different people have different attitudes to this, and probably ethically I ought to. Probably ethically I ought to say, well, before I wrote this blog, I showed a draft to Professor whatever. But most of the time what I'm doing, first of all, I never accuse anybody of fraud. I tend to say things like, in this article, this number should equal this number plus this number, but it doesn't. And as long as I've got someone else, to check that I'm not adding these numbers up wrong, there really isn't much you can say about that. Now, obviously, I don't blog about every time two numbers don't add up in an article. So, there's by reputation, if I blog about something like that, I'm probably, someone's probably come to me. If I blog about, marine biology, or I've got a preprint coming out next day or two about radicalization, political radicalization, I don't know anything about those topics. So it means somebody's come to me with a, and I've gone and helped them with it. But first of all, before I'm going to start working on something, it has to look moderately important, and it has to look moderately substantial. So if you just write a blog post, say, hey, I opened this article and it said we tested 49 people, and in the data set there are 44, and 12 of them all have the same date of birth and height and sex and weight, but different answers, that sort of thing. That's just a statement of fact. This is the data file you supplied. If they want to come back and say, oh, sorry, those were the test data, that's a reasonably popular excuse when people get caught. Is, oh yes, we accidentally uploaded the fake test data that we made to test our code with. So I don't get too much pushback in that sense. Also because I'm an outsider, so I'm not letting anybody down. So I've never worked in academia. I've never been paid to work in academia other than the occasional marking assignment. So I'm not part of any establishment, and I'm not part of any great history. And I don't have people who I owe favors to from 25 years ago, or who I have grudges against from 25 years ago. So there was a kind of a backlash about 8-10 years ago when we were talking more about open science and making your data open. But there were still some criticisms at the time of some stuff that was getting on towards fraud. And I only recently realized actually that one of those was probably aimed at me. but I didn't put two and two together at the time, where I don't know if she was present, but a senior person in the American Psychological Society wrote an editorial accusing people of, among other things, methodological terrorism. And it turned out it was 2 months after I'd written a blog post pointing out that in one of her articles there were some impossible numbers. But I literally didn't put two and two together at the time because the whole atmosphere at the time was so kind of febrile it could have meant anybody. Those words got withdrawn from the final version of that article, the methodological terrorism words. But it was clear that people didn't think that anybody had much of a right to go around, poking their nose into other people's numbers, even when those numbers were just demonstrably incompatible with mathematical truth. We were sort of meant to, never not mind about that, and it's some trivial little error. And I do find it strange that people who claim to be scientists don't think that it's a problem that there is even one misreported number in their article, let alone the key result has been miscalculated and cannot be mathematically correct. And then they sort of grudgingly issue a correction 6 months later and say this does not change the results. This does not change the conclusions of the article, even though their key statistical result was inverted. So now at that point I can't do anything more. That's for the editors and the learned societies to sort out whether or not having your key statistical result reversed is a problem or not. Personally, I think it is, but that's where I stop. I'm just there to say, hey, these numbers aren't right and aren't possible. So, but in terms of the worst that happened was one time, and it was very minor indeed, and it wasn't even a major serious problem in the paper. I don't think the paper was even fraudulent. It was just sloppy, and I blogged about some problems, and the authors wrote a fairly snotty letter back, basically saying, yes, but these results, this doesn't matter. Again, when people say their numbers don't matter, it's science. The numbers matter, for goodness sake. And I sort of think I put an update. I said, update, Dr. Blah Blah wrote to me to say, and I quoted like 2 sentences verbatim out of this email. And they wrote me a nasty gram with a copy to my dean. I was a PhD student at the time, accusing me of infringing their human rights by printing 2 sentences out of their email verbatim. Now, of course, if someone sends you an email, you have a choice. You can either quote it verbatim, or you can report that Professor Smith wrote to me and indicated that ... and paraphrase it. But obviously, if you paraphrase it, these people are going to say you have misrepresented what we said. So, heads they win, tails you lose. So I don't feel bad about I tend these days, I'll say to somebody, can I use your thing verbatim or shall I paraphrase it? And if they want to say, well, don't do either, it's like, no, that's not an option. But if they say, yes, you can paraphrase it, then I will paraphrase it. And if they then want to come back and say, hey, you didn't paraphrase me right, then I go, well, you paraphrase it then, because I think this is a fair here is the original. So there's all kinds of ways in which people hide behind the fact that in polite society, we don't question these kinds of things. And you see this also, in most forms of, or many things, in politics and in any lawsuit or any kind of middle class lawsuit, which doesn't involve the actual police. It's always very sort of, how dare you, calumnious accusation, whatever. And there's a reason why. There's a reason why police officers tend to socialize mostly with other police officers, and vice versa. Most non-police officers don't tend to socialize with police officers, and that's because you need the police to be relatively neutral and not involved. And if you're good buddies with a police officer, he's aware that one day he might have to bust you. He probably won't have to bust you, Lance, but as a general point, he might have to bust you. And the problem we have in academia is that everybody knows everybody else. Some fields are tiny, but all fields are finite. And universities are people who've been patting each other on the back and going to receptions for 25 years. And all of a sudden, oh no, I think Lance is a werewolf. You know, it isn't like you just arrived. If you just arrived last week, you know, whenever you join an organization for the first week or two, it's like, we don't like you, Lance, go away. But once you've been there a certain amount of time and got your feet under the desk and got friends and joined one or two of the tribes, it's really hard to get rid of somebody who's part of the furniture. You know, because, you know, even if there are no bodies that you know where they're buried, you know, just nobody went into academia to be in the business of investigating their colleagues. You know, it's hugely painful to have to do that, to even contemplate that Lance let us down, you know, and then to, you know, it is monumentally painful to have to do. So I understand why people are reluctant to do it, but that's why you're paid, you know, that's why you're paid $800,000 a year to be president of the university, dude.
Yeah, so I'm curious about that, because you know, from my perspective, it often seems like there is a kind of resentment or disinterest, or like my impression is that psychology overall, the people in the field don't really like investigations. They don't want to have their research audited. They don't want to share their research. I find that just immensely puzzling. You know, as you say, you know, in science, the numbers matter, and yet people are often dismissive of the numbers in their own studies. I just find the whole thing bizarre. So you've alluded to some of why that might be the case, like why people might not want to accuse other people because, you know, these are your colleagues, people are invested in the same field as one another. But is that your impression as well? And if so, what do you think is going on with people? Like, why are psychologists so? Why do they have such a strong aversion to precision and being careful and double checking and making sure things aren't fraudulent? Like, you know, from my perspective, it would be great if as much as what is possible within, like, you know, sometimes data is like medical and you need certain types of privacy, but as much as is possible, data transparency, sharing data, all of that stuff. And yet people seem really reluctant to do this. And not just like, oh, that's too much work. It's like they're hostile towards it. And I don't understand it.
If only we had a scientific study of human behavior, a scientific field that studied human behavior that could tell us why this happens. I think, frankly, a lot of the time, I think a lot of psychologists don't believe in psychology. They don't. Most psychologists don't behave as if psychology is real. If you go to a faculty meeting of the social psychology department, it is no better organized than a faculty meeting of the physics department. All the same cognitive biases are on display. All the same power struggles, and, you know, everything is exactly the same. This isn't true, for example, of psychotherapists. Psychotherapists, by and large, live that world, for better or worse. I spent when I was doing my master in psychology, at the end of Saturday evening, it was executive education model, so Friday evenings, all day Saturday, Sunday mornings. And on the Saturday evenings, we all went to the pub and we talked shit. When I spent a year in a psychotherapy school, we did not go to the pub after class. We did not take off our masks and go to the pub and be people in the pub having beer. You know, if we ever went to the pub, which was about twice, it was because we were continuing something really interesting from class that we all really wanted to chew on. And so I think there's an extent to which psychologists don't necessarily believe in what they're doing. I think also a lot of publications are just a means to an end. And the end is getting across whatever it is that the psychologist believes in. And if they're, if they're left of center, it may well be a left of center political course. If they're right of center, it can sometimes be a right of center political course. And clearly, psychologists in their majority are left of center, but that issue doesn't seem to be particularly left or right. It's just a reflection of the people themselves. A lot of psychologists are pushing some kind of agenda, possibly a political one, quite often also just a personal enrichment one. They have their theory, they have their package, they have their mass market book either ready to go or at least ready to pitch. Phenomenon, the new science of whatever by some guy, PhD, on sale in your airport now, $17.99. Read this and you'll become a better employer. And there's a ton of that around. You can get $30,000 for a keynote. You can get $100,000 for a couple of days consulting at Google about your sort of latest idea, TED Talk type idea. And I think there is obviously there aren't that many people doing all of that, but there comes a point for a lot of psychologists, I think, where they are identified with an idea, they're identified with a theory, and they're not terribly interested in rigorously falsifying that. Because if they did, they would be kind of out there. That would affect the business model, if only of the lab. And so, by the time you're 35, you've got your theory, something theory, and all those words have capital letters. And, you have your lab that is based around that, and you get grants based on that, and life is sweet. And, you maybe have tenure and you're doing okay. But it doesn't seem to very often result in kind of what we might call technology, what we might call something that definitively works and is useful. And I think the principal beneficiaries of much of psychology, and I tip my hat to the clinical psychologists and the therapists, but the purpose of a lot of psychology seems to be kind of self-referential.
That's an extremely pessimistic take, but I think I share that attitude. I just wrote a couple blog posts that are so similar to this. I wrote one that's called "Philosophy Isn't About Philosophy," and what I argue there is that it worries me that I think because I'm in two fields, I'm in psychology and philosophy. I think a lot of philosophers don't want to resolve philosophical issues, and they don't want to use methods that would do so because philosophy for them is recreational. It's a game for them to play to show off how clever they are. And they get to write papers and seem smart and go to cocktail parties. And if they used methods that revealed that most of what they're talking about is bullshit, they wouldn't be able to do that. And I'm just losing confidence in psychology myself. One after another, I'm seeing paradigms collapse. And I don't know what's true in psychology anymore. A lot of people that were grad students around the time I was or are now are probably having a similar experience. So, you say psychologists often act as if psychology is not true. The first thing I thought about is, as far as I know, and who knows if it holds up, the literature on interviews shows that in many contexts they're not very effective. And yet you get interviewed to join a psychology department, even though it doesn't look like interviews, like they crowd out more useful information. So why do they use interviews? It looks like psychologists don't practice what they preach. And I think that speaks to them maybe not really trusting their own discipline. So, I think there's a lot to what you're saying there. And I worry that it generalizes to other fields, or that they have their own flavor of the people in those fields not really pursuing the academic endeavors they pursue because they want to get at the truth, but for all these sort of internal self-referential reasons. So yeah, what I wanted to ask though is, and this I think is a really important question, and I don't think it's an easy one to answer, which is, how much data fabrication is there, I guess, in psychology? And out of that data fabrication, how much of that are we catching or are we able to catch?
Well, we don't know because we can't really know, but I think we can ask ourselves questions such as, supposing that half of all published studies were essentially fake one way or another, how would the world look different to what it does now? And the failures to replicate are so numerous. I read the other day, albeit not at a very reliable source, but I read the other day a number that I find plausible, that somebody estimated that in the Journal of Consumer Research, which is on the periphery of psychology, that something like only 11% of results replicate. Part of the reason, of course, is we don't do replications because we're all much too busy pushing our own clever little theories. But I suspect a lot. I suspect a lot. And we've seen this recently with the Ariely Gino case, where there's a project to go and dig out data that may have been collected by people who've been accused of fraud or credibly associated with fraud, and they're now finding other papers that are clearly fraudulent that weren't involving those people, or well, the studies weren't involving data collected by those people. And I think there is a large house of cards that could come down around this, because the known fraudulent papers do not look all that different from the believed not fraudulent papers. The net effects are still the same, and these things are, I mean, they're often very uninteresting things, and they're things that you can't even apply, but no one's going to reproduce them because it's not like you're going to do a phase 2 and a phase 3 trial on them. So it's quite easy, I think, to publish providing your relative. You have to. It's difficult. You have to hit the sweet spot. You have to find something that will advance your career, but not something that will create enough of a buzz that people will go and try and replicate it and discover that you're wrong. And that's usually fairly safe in psychology. But you see, for example, every couple of months now we have a story about room temperature superconductors, and I mean it's just ridiculous to make up a story about room temperature superconductors because the world's finest physicists are going to go out there and find what's wrong with it. But claims that under these circumstances these people do that. Your aim is to get the publicity. Your aim is to get featured in Huffington Post. Your aim is to get a TED talk, maybe. But no one's ever really going to disprove it. Also, because in psychology, you can always invoke differences in the procedure. So, for example, and this is quite interesting. Actually, I told you I translated Diederik Stapel's book, and it's a nicely written book. And in almost every chapter, he talks about a different aspect of social psychology theory. And if you want to get an idea of what people in social psychology were working on in 2011, it's quite a good book. But almost every one of those theories, if you look at it now in 2023, is under a smaller or larger cloud. And if you think about, for example, there's a theory of money priming, which is that if you expose people to images of money, it will unleash their inner rapacious capitalist, because money is so terrible that even the mere sight of it, it's kind of like pornography for your capitalist part of your brain. And there are these, ridiculous studies where people fill in a questionnaire, and on the opposite side of the, on the right-hand page and on the left-hand page is a photo, and it's either of a puppy or of a $20 bill. And their responses to these questions are like radically distorted simply because it was the puppy or the $20 bill. And somebody did a large-scale replication of one of these studies, and the original authors, and it failed, produced no result whatsoever. And the original authors came back and said, yes, but you see, we were using undergraduates from the University of Chicago. And here at the University of Chicago, there's a very big and famous business school. And so obviously our psychology undergraduates will have been, influenced by the presence of the business school to be more sensitive to issues around capitalism. I mean, just complete bullshit. If you tried that in a court of law, absolutely everybody would go, what? But you can do this among academics. It quite often seems to me that the less you know about psychology, the more obviously bullshit some of this stuff is. But you're in an emperor's new clothes situation, and no one's going to go, excuse me, the king's butt is hanging out of his non-existent trousers. It was, and you look at this and it's laughable, but you can't in the literature go, there's that Jim Carrey me going, oh come on, you can't do that. So you can actually come out with the most outrageous bullshit explanations, which is interesting, isn't it? We're doing science and they come out with the equivalent of, oh, well, yes, but actually the moon is made of green cheese. And then we all have to sort of pretend that, nothing ever happened and there was never a problem and okay, fine, we accept your explanation. What happens, of course, is it gets packed away to be brought out at some later date, possibly. But publicly, nothing ever happens. The media don't get interested. And really nothing much happens about misconduct unless the media are interested, because the institutions will always bury it because it just isn't in their interest, with one or two honorable exceptions. But the media will normally not take an interest until the alumni office are phoning and saying, hey, we're getting a lot of bad publicity about this story. People are calling to cancel donations. And then they might move. But it's fairly rare for them to do anything without external pressure in the media, in the official media.
So is it, there's a few barriers to really addressing these. One of those is academic institutions themselves. How do they tend to respond? Like, I already know the answer to this, but how do they tend to respond when accusations of fraud are made or appear credible, or there's enough anomalies in a paper, regardless of, we can't read people's minds, but if there's enough anomalies in a paper where the paper should be retracted, and this starts spreading to a researcher's whole corpus of work, how do the academic institutions they're at tend to respond? And of course, there's notable exceptions. And then how do the journals where these papers are published tend to respond?
Well, the modal response is no response at all. The modal response is just to pretend they never got the email. But if they do respond, quite often what will happen is the university will say, well, we can't take any action unless the journal retracts the paper. And the journal will say we can't retract the paper until the university has taken some form of disciplinary action. You want to kind of put the two phones together and have them talk to each other. So that's one way that they have of stalling it. They will generally do absolutely anything to avoid actually having to investigate it. And again, that is partly for the legitimate reason that this is absolutely no fun to do, but it's also because it damages their reputation. And if they can think that they can hold the line and avoid the damage to their reputation, so avoiding damage to their reputation is much, much more important than any sort of doing the right thing. That sort of, rather old-fashioned notion we might have that they would do the right thing. Again, with exceptions, but by and large, and if you think about it, first of all, the publishers of the academic journals are literally not interested in whether anything they publish is true or not. They are entirely neutral on the matter. They might say that if it's true, then that's a bonus, but they are interested in collecting the publication fees or collecting the subscriptions and doing the page formatting at minimum cost. That's their businesses. That's what they're there to do. They have no fiduciary duty to the truth, and good luck to them. And even the not-for-profit journals are often pretty wishy-washy. The universities, well, first of all, they are also essentially, I can't remember who said this, it may be my colleague James Heathers, but universities are basically hedge funds with brick buildings or something like along those lines. The universities, the first duty of a university president is to their endowment and or their revenue stream. So the only way to generally to get them to do anything is to indicate that those are in danger. So nobody's very interested. Nobody's very interested. In addition, the people who are at the top of universities got there by being part of the game for the last 30 years, not necessarily in psychology. And so as far as they're concerned, as a minimum, the system is pretty sweet. They don't see anything wrong with the system. They got to be president. The system works pretty damn well for them. And they've forgotten about all the people who dropped out. And in addition, quite a lot of them themselves will have been using some dubious research practices to get the fame and fortune that then turned them into a senior person that then made them a candidate for being dean or president. There was a story of one of the whistleblowers in the Starple case who went to a professor and said, look, we think this is going on. They said, but why would he need to fabricate data? He's the dean. And we've seen with the story at Stanford, the president of the university with tons and tons of dodgy papers going back a long time. This is not just when he was like the most senior person and notionally in charge of the lab and not paid. We're going back to when he was a working bench scientist. There's obviously something pretty bad going on. And I think there's probably quite a lot of that as well. We've got the case this week of the president of Harvard with plagiarism in her PhD. Not especially bad plagiarism by plagiarism standards, but I mean, that's kind of that's a pretty weak defense. There shouldn't be any. What is the right amount of sentences to have copied and very slightly altered from other people's documents? She may only have 20 or 30 in her PhD, I don't know. But the correct number of statements to have is 0. And any number above that, again, I only robbed one bank. Are you calling me a bank robber? So there's lots and lots and lots of that, because that's how people get to the top in most organizations. They do it by hard work, talent, and the other stuff you have to do. And that's just how our society works. It's how all of our institutions work. We shouldn't be surprised by it. We shouldn't clutch our pearls about it. But because it's science and academia, we have this sort of, heavenly noise and shaft of light coming in. These are just flesh and blood human beings, who do what they have to do to get and keep their senior positions, and that's how it is getting and keeping a senior position in any organization. There's a reason why I took early retirement from where I was working.
Yeah, well, so that brings me to my next question, which is that a lot of what you're doing here, you're not in a formal position. It's not like you don't have a badge like data investigator. So I guess what I want to get to is, what can be done to improve the state of things? Because, if we have all these issues, maybe they're not really avoidable, but, we could at least do our best to mitigate them. Do you think that we need some sort of formal investigative body for accessing data and investigating? Like, what kinds of norms and institutions do you think might be able to assist in exposing, minimizing, preventing in the first place data fabrication?
I think it would require the kind of root and branch reform of science that isn't going to happen. I do find it amusing when people will start a blog post or a Twitter thread and sort of, if we could just do X, and it's like, yeah, but you can't. That isn't going to happen, is it? If the journals would just all agree to this one common data standard or some, completely implausible thing. So first of all, it's not going to happen because it's going to require the entire highly lucrative industry of science as it is done to be upended. And while there are people coming in at the bottom who might, be prepared to stand around for a year or two while we just stop everything and blow it all up. And while there may even be one or two people at the very top, close to retirement, who are prepared to, I don't know, go in front of some kind of science, truth and reconciliation commission and confess to their sins. There's all the people in the middle. There's all the people in the middle. And you're going to say to those people, okay, you've done 12 years of career. You're maybe a year off tenure. You've got this, you've got these many papers. You've got this. Sorry, everything you did up till now doesn't count. And it's difficult to go to people in their late 30s and early 40s and tell them they've been wasting that time. So those people are, as they say in the UK, they're not going to be turkeys voting for Christmas. And I think that's, I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's possible. We already have the office of so the NIH has the Office of Research Integrity, which is a complete joke, unless you have embezzled $10 million or somebody has died as a result of your experiment, they don't get out of bed. And nobody else is interested because it's not hurting anybody else at the moment. So until we get to the point where people, I think the one glimmer of hope is that scientists, by and large, with the exception of one or two psychopaths, scientists by and large are nice, educated people with relatively sheltered backgrounds and lives. And they are probably afraid of being caught at some point, at some level. They would probably react. If they thought the chance that they were caught was above homeopathic, then I think you could make quite a lot of change for only a small actual chance of being caught. And so, but I don't see how you formalize the checking because I don't see who's going to do it. And I don't see who is going to, have this job for 4 or 5 years and then say after their PhD maybe and say, right, I'd actually quite like to go back and doing science now, which is what I love, bench science. Who's going to hire someone who has just spent the last 5 years forensically going through every bit of data in everybody's articles they came across? No one's going to hire those people. So
yeah, I'm in this position where I just got my PhD, and this stuff is what motivates me. I don't want to be part of a field that is unwilling or unable to open itself to investigation, where the general norms, not any particular people, I'm sure lots of individuals care about what's true, where the general attitude in the field is just not what I want it to be. I want to focus on criticism, and if that makes me unhireable, then I'm willing to accept that. But I don't know how many other people are, and I don't know how many of us are or will remain in academia. So, I think that we are both fans of Adam Mastriani, who is now on Substack writing a blog and is not doing, is not in an academic position to my knowledge anymore. I might end up in a similar situation myself where, you could end up having critics from the outside. Now, Adam has a lot of fans and followers and seems to be pretty successful. So maybe if some of us can step outside the system where if we're not embedded in the academic system, of us put pressure on the academic world that maybe some change could, I'm not expecting us to be able to reformulate everything from the ground up. I don't even know what that would look like, but I don't know. I feel like if enough of us do enough work, maybe we can make some positive change. I don't know.
I think at the moment the system requires people to cheat because there is so much science that has to be produced, and relative to the number of even remotely interesting questions that there are to be asked. And you see this with every master's student's project is a mediation study, even though a mediation study with cross-sectional data, because officially you can still publish those, even though no one's ever going to read it. But why have we got the master's student there? Well, because we sell bums on seats to master's students. We have labs and they have to put PhD students through them. We just have too many people. We have too many people coming in, and they've all got to get significant results. And so one of my preferred solutions would be to reduce the amount of research being done, certainly in fields like much of psychology, by about 90%. The actual amount of studies being run. We can talk about how many people are running them, the size of the project and the budget. But even then, I would have a drastic reduction in the number of people who are being trained in psychology. But psychology is in demand. I think it's probably still the number one undergraduate subject, certainly in Europe. And everybody wants to know why their dad's an asshole and their mum's an alcoholic or whatever it is. And they think that psychology is going to teach them that. And we don't tell them in advance that actually it's about 70% statistics. So we continue to sell psychology on false pretenses to undergraduates. But as long as that machine is in place and generating bums on seats for the universities, that isn't going to change. I don't know who's going to sort of educate the world at large that actually, if you're thinking of applying for psychology, you're going to have to be a lot better at mathematics than you probably are, and while still also being good with people. That's the brilliant thing, isn't it? To be a good psychologist, you ostensibly have to be good with people, but you've also got to be able to understand, the chi-square distribution as a minimum. And that's not many people live high school with both of those skill sets. So I think if I had a magic wand, and this really is magic wand territory, I would say far, far, far fewer scientists. And then I would also change the funding system so that there is a lot of auditing of what's going on. And while I'm at it, since my magic wand is inexhaustible, I would only have journals that are published by the funders. So when you get a grant from my funding agency, I expect you to submit a manuscript within, a year, 2 years, saying what you did with it, and I will publish it. And I will publish that manuscript. I'll try and get it revised, but I will publish it whatever the results. As long as it's, and if you write a terrible one, then I'll take some money out of your next grant in order to pay for somebody to write it a bit better. But we can't have this situation where you give people money and then they decide basically what to research and they decide what to publish and they decide what results to come up with, and then they pay Elsevier to do it. It's completely absurd. And if I was a funder, whether I was a taxpayer or a foundation, I would be running my journal, and it would be the journal of research that I funded. And it would publish a report on every single study that I gave money to. This is obviously very naive, but I really don't see what's kind of difficult about that, other than the fact that the entire system at the moment is set up, in a radically different way. And we saw during COVID with the all of a sudden the conferences going online, and you had learned societies whose business, who were kind of running out of money because their entire business model was people paying $2,500 to go and eat sandwiches at their conference for 3 days, and have little recruitment meetings in hotels and get sexually harassed at the bar and all that kind of other stuff that goes on at conferences. But it's a machine. It's a machine. It's a machine. It runs on an annual calendar. We have to bring in the 2024 intake. We have to bring in the 2025 intake, and there's no point that allows you to get off that. So I don't see any of my magic wand wishes coming true. But if I could stop science for 5 years While hold on a minute while I and of course, lots and lots of things in that plan are obviously wrong and will be both rightly and wrongly resisted. So there's no it's a huge major human problem, and the universe does not necessarily owe us a solution to that. So I'm much
you
happier
mentioned conferences. Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, go ahead. Finish. I know what
No,
I want to ask.
I finished. I was rambling.
Oh, okay. I wanted to ask about conferences because I posted about this recently. So I have difficulties with travel, and I've never really had the money to go to all these conferences. So I just don't go. And I keep being told, you got to go to conferences. You got to go to conferences. Now, I've been to, I don't know, a half dozen, a dozen conferences. I don't remember how many I've been to. It looks to me like not too many people are interested in the talks. I don't see why I couldn't read the paper, or they could record a talk, or I could watch it on Zoom, or they could just make a YouTube channel like I did. They have a million options where they could create, like I could go on TikTok right now, make a video and have 500 people watch it by the end of the day. That's more than people go to that will go to a conference, and it's people all over the world. So what I'm curious about is why do we need all these conferences? Like, this is set up for someone somewhere to make money somewhere? That wouldn't, just like, what are they for? Why do we need them? Because as soon as the COVID stuff started to subside, they got rid of the online conferences like real quick. And I'm back to never attending anything anymore. And I don't think I'm going to. I don't want to travel and spend thousands of dollars to eat a stand. Like, this is what I ended up doing. One of the last conferences I went to, well, I don't remember any of the talks. What I remember is the restaurants I went to while I was at the conference. That's what I remember. And I'd rather spend my money to go to a food tour where I don't have to waste my time pretending that I care about what's happening at a conference.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah. So why do conferences occur, and what is up with this?
First of all, they make money, and they enable people who think that schmoozing will help their career to schmooze. There are opportunities for casual sex. I mean, all conferences in all walks of life are opportunities for a variety of social activities, but never underestimate the appeal of casual sex. They make money for the learned societies, and they enable a little bit of control. Who's talking to whom, among the informal corridors of power of the field. And job offers, things like that. And hey, did you see who went into that breakout session, or did you see who had dinner with who? And scuttlebutt, all normal human things, which is quite interesting, isn't it? Psychologists again should be telling us why these things are so appealing. But they're an anachronism. It used to be it was the only way you would ever meet your colleagues. Or in any great number, and now we have video conferencing, which is not perfect, but if you've met someone in real life once, you can maintain a very good relationship with them over video for quite a few years afterwards. I do like to meet people in the flesh occasionally after we've established an online friendship, but it only needs to be for a small amount of time, and it's not even fully necessary. I remember before the pandemic asking some therapists, because I was interested in trying to see if I could get some therapy for an English-speaking person here in Spain from a UK-based therapist, and they were all very, we don't like the video, and that isn't the same thing as being in the room. And then during the pandemic, they kind of discovered, I mean, conveniently, but I think also truly, that you can get a surprising amount done as long as you have a decent video connection. You can get a surprising amount of emotion and stuff across. So, conferences are as anachronistic as are the idea that we have journals with page numbers and that our preferred medium for delivering a scientific article is a PDF of a 10 by 8 A4 page image. And we have typesetters and all that kind of stuff, and kerning and all that. And really, all we really want is the HTML, and that we can click on the figures to make them bigger. And the PDF is a terrible way of communicating information, but it's because we're emulating paper. But when we transitioned from paper to online, that took a while. There wasn't a radical bang. Now, looking back, it's ridiculous that we have the PDFs, but who's going to transition away from that? Who's going to transition away from even the online journals typically format a PDF as if they could one day print it. Whereas, obviously science should be communicated by living XML documents. But there are various rules about, the thing of, there was a question the other day, somebody had, the final proofs had been messed up by the publisher. They'd inserted some kind of systematic error. But now it had the DOI, and apparently the only way the authors could get this fixed was for the authors to issue an erratum for the errors that the publisher's copy editor had introduced. And it's, are you going to go through that hassle, even though your article looks like crap because of something that you didn't do? And they only give you one chance. They only give you one chance to correct errors. You get your thing for copy editing, you find all of the errors, you put them in, and then if they make further errors while trying to fix your errors, that's it. Tough shit. And we allow this to happen because the publishers don't answer to us. Terribly sorry, we're here adding so much value. So that's obsolete, and the conferences are obsolete. And we should be having more of this kind of call. And then, but I mean, a couple of years ago, everyone was, I've decided not to fly to any conferences anymore to save the planet. And I'd seen one or two of those people with their, hi, I am in relatively exotic location. Because they couldn't not, either for professional reasons or they enjoyed it too much or whatever. But not everyone, of course we should be traveling less. Of course we should be traveling for the planet, and because it's useless and because it's a massive amount of time and jet lag to go to a conference in the US for a week, and I might go to one or two presentations that are really interesting, all the hanging around, all the it's just it's just painful. But there are people whose lifestyle fits very nicely around that. They tend to be fairly senior and fairly powerful. Quite often they're being comped to the conference if they aren't getting paid $10,000 and $15,000 to give the keynote. And nice plush upgrade at the hotel. System works pretty well for them. And the grad students having to pay $450 registration out of their own pocket and buy a discounted $200 society membership to be able to go along, and they're getting a $300 stipend towards their $700 air ticket, are paying for that out of their own pocket in the hope of one day. What was that book? There was a book, I think it was the book called Gang Leader for a Day, about a sociologist who,
don't know,
according to his story anyway, infiltrated a gang. And I think it was in that book. It may have been another, but I think it was in that book. And it was the discussion was, if drug dealers make so much money, why do so many of them live with their mom? And it turns out that the average drug gang is structured financially a bit like McDonald's. So you've got a lot of people at the bottom earning less than minimum wage. Apologies, McDonald's, if everyone in your restaurants makes minimum wage. And then there's someone at the top making $10 million a year. And academia is not unlike that. When I see what a tenured professor at an Ivy League school makes, and then when you see what they're paying the what's it called? Casual, the people they hire to give
adjunct instructors.
The people they hire to give the the intro stats classes, adjunct. What the adjunct?
Yeah, like adjunct instructors. Yeah.
The adjuncts on food stamps sleeping in their car, and the at both private and in some cases public schools, this huge disparity, and particularly in the US. But you kind of wonder, well, isn't there you know, shouldn't the universities be making some kind of example of how to be a slightly better society? But I guess maybe that's a very leftist approach. The universities themselves, yeah, you've got they are very much left of center, except when it comes to the whole remuneration thing, at which point they are pretty good at modeling themselves on corporations. So yeah, it's because of the power. It's because of the, where were we, conferences? Yeah, it's because of the power and the. Why wouldn't you go to a conference? It's a great place to be. People follow me around and call me sir.
Yeah, you got the numbers on a lot of that right too, like the plane ticket, but you only get $300 to cover the travel, but the ticket's $700. Then you got to pay for food, all the travel expenses. If you're bringing luggage, all extra fees when you do everything, maybe Uber as a trainer or taxi.
Ask me how I know.
Yeah, it's just
I've attended several conferences entirely out of pocket, and I can afford to do that. I can afford to do that. I'm retired, I'm comfortable, and I can tell my wife it's part of the vacation budget, and sometimes she comes along too for a couple of days. But I don't go to very many conferences because I have better ways to spend my vacation budget, frankly.
I've wanted to organize online events, and there doesn't seem to be a ton of interest. Like, the reason I would in principle want to interact with people in my field is because I actually want to talk about the topics in my papers and their papers. And it's just baffling to me. I work in this very narrow area where there doesn't seem to be any will or interest in organizing consistent meetings to talk about the topics that we do research on. I could organize it myself, and maybe I will, and maybe a lot of people just don't want to do that. But it's weird. It seems to me like the people in my areas of the areas I work in are not that interested in the areas that they work in. I don't get it. Maybe I'm just idiosyncratic. I don't want to socialize that. Maybe it's just me. I'm not averse to socializing within limited context. And like you, I like to meet people for short periods. I don't like to just meet people online. But yeah, something about conferences, they just seem like excess and extravagance. I do worry that they serve this gatekeeping role where, if I'm not speaking at conferences in my areas, I don't count as a member of the field in certain respects socially. People don't know my face. They don't know my name. I don't like that. It's not just that I think that that's a waste of money and time and resources, and it's bad for the planet, it's bad for individuals, and it's exploitative, and it creates power asymmetries between wealthy senior professors and graduate students. I also worry that it actually exacerbates gatekeeping and other means of socially managing who is and isn't in a field in ways that can shut out critics. And in this case, I'm not just thinking of psychology, but another area I'm in philosophy. Almost all my work in both areas is highly critical of the work within those fields. And I would like to have the narrative that everybody's been really, in some respects, hostile towards my criticisms, but they haven't. Some people are receptive. But I don't know if that's because I don't want to see science and academia ostensibly to function as a de facto social club when the purposes of journals and conferences and all these sorts of things ought to be to disseminate information. And I have all these naive, high-minded ideals, and it just seems so very far from that I just find myself in a perpetual state of being frustrated with pretty much every aspect of academia conferences. So it's cool to see that you have a similar perspective on them. And if anything, have raised more concerns I didn't even know about. So that's conferences. I want to ask if it's okay. I'm curious about your attitude towards, and maybe this will be the last topic that, I don't know if it's two topics or one topic, but I am curious about your perspective on the peer review system. Is it a good system? To me, it's hard to think about the current peer review system without thinking of it in terms of its integration into academic publishing, which I have massive issues with the way that that's run, and you've already raised some of those concerns. But I am curious about your perspective on the peer review process itself, what role it plays in science, whether it's like a good idea and the way that it's implemented, that sort of thing. Just, yeah, your general take on peer review, if you have one, if that's a topic we could talk about.
Well, it seems to be a bit of a lottery, although most of my peer-reviewed pieces, I think I've been getting, I suppose everybody thinks they get stricter than average review. But when you're going to come up and criticize an article that the editor or the previous editor published in a journal, they're probably going to go out and dig out some fairly serious reviewers. Sometimes I see a fairly terrible paper, and it might be in a journal like the Frontier series, which published the peer reviews alongside. And you click on the review, and the review is like 3 sentences. 2 3-sentence reviews, and it gets published. And I think for a lot of very boring mainstream stuff, another churned out paper by a master's student, I think the reviewing is very often extremely light, but it kind of doesn't matter because the paper doesn't matter either. I try to take all my reviews fairly seriously, or else I don't accept to do the review if I think it's going to be, oh God, another one of these kind of studies. There's one journal I review for a lot, and they send me quite a few, indistinguishable. You can see it's going to be a mediation study from cross-sectional data, and after you've written the same review 4 times as to why this is a terrible idea, it gets a bit, I would actually be I found myself at one point copying and pasting chunks out of a previous review, which is probably the point where you need to sort of stop and think what you're doing. I used to think it was kind of a necessary but insufficient step. Then we had the whole preprint revolution. But the dirty little secret, when the idea of preprints was that you would put your stuff out there and then anyone could review it and criticize it. But the dirty little secret of preprints is that nobody will review or criticize your preprint. They will just read it. They might even send you some nice feedback about it personally. But you're never going to get anybody to sit down, roll up their sleeves, and spend the 4 or 5 hours that they might normally do systematically reviewing a paper and making notes and structuring the review into paragraphs, which at least I try to do, and most of the people who review for me, I think, tend to try to do. The people just aren't going to do that because you haven't got the structure around you that kind of imposes that on you. You're online, you're in hypothesis.is or whatever markup system you're using, and you're online. It is a little bit LOL, LOL at your typo sometimes. So and then what's the point of doing that? You aren't even getting credit for it on what's that site that counts your peer reviews?
I can't remember.
Publons, which has now been taken over by someone. But at Publons, you could upload your thing and you can have your little scoreboard of how many reviews you've done. Or I tend to add them to my CV because I don't want to put some of them in Publons. And it reminds me a little bit, or a lot of situations remind me of this actually. So this if I talk to you again in another year's time, this anecdote will certainly come up. But if you remember the end or the scene very near the end of Saving Private Ryan, and you have Tom Hanks as the extremely conscientious, duty-following officer, and he's wounded, mortally wounded as it turns out, and he's lying there, up against a wall, and this tank is coming towards him. And his platoon is out of ammo, they're out of everything, and he has 6 shots left in his service revolver. And the rules require him to continue to engage the enemy until he has no ammunition left. He fires these 6 shots at this tank, which clearly is not going to have much of an effect. But right at the end, the last shot, the tank explodes, and he sort of wonders how he managed to blow up the tank with this Colt revolver. And of course, then you see the planes fly over and they have hit the tank with a rocket at the very moment he fired the last bullet. All of this to say that I do sometimes find myself being a little bit Tom Hanks, going, well, I've got to do this now. I've got to do this peer review. I will do the best I can. I don't know if it's necessarily, but I do try and do that as a kind of abstract exercise, a bit like I might, in another world, go to the gym, and do something not terribly enjoyable in the gym, but for the benefit of having done it. Or I might, if I were religious, I might go on some retreat, or I might pray hard or whatever, because it will do my soul good rather than for any kind of immediate, hedonic reward. So I do reviewing from that point of view, and I find it sometimes useful from that point of view. But in terms of its ability to identify problems, we know it's very limited. So sorry, I got distracted. So we went over this preprint thing, and the problem was that the publishers got hold of the preprint. So now the publishers have preprint servers. And we saw this during COVID. People would upload complete bullshit cures for COVID to the Lancet's preprint server run by Elsevier, and it was called Preprints by the Lancet. And absolutely anybody could put providing it kind of, it passed a 10-second visual check of does this look like a scientific paper? And before you knew it, it was the Lancet says that X or Y cures COVID. And because nobody who naively thought, preprints are great, they'll save us waiting for the peer review to get my brilliant ideas in front of the public, didn't think about the bad actors who would come along. And a great deal, I've seen with the fraud, a great deal of academic science is completely non-robust to bad actors. It is entirely based on the idea that everybody is acting in good faith. And there are a couple of problems there. One is the very bad actors who are definitely not acting in good faith, but also all of us act in bad faith and self-interest from time to time. When we write an article, when you write an article, it puts the best possible spin on your ideas. And then the reviewer's job should be to come along and say, well, steady on with this claim and, whatever. But they never fully pull you back to the center. You make a couple of compromises with them. And so we're all, to some extent, bad actors because we all want our ideas to be out there, and we all would quite like to get promotion and tenure and all that other stuff. So even the people who are fundamentally honest are being a little bit bad actors. But there are lots of really, really, really bad actors leveraging science, and the preprint system, it turns out, left us wide open to them. So I don't know what, do we have to stop having preprints for certain categories of article? Do we need to educate science journalists better? Well, obviously. But even then, the bad actors were putting their preprints up and then spreading them all over the internet within 6 hours. And everyone's going, but this isn't peer reviewed. It's like, yeah, but we're scientists. We did a good job. Please believe us. So public trust in science, I think, requires that articles have been through some kind of review. The problem is that we as scientists are always going to try and gain that. If you submit an article and it comes back with, except with minor revisions on the first draft, you're punching the air. You're going, yes, I am number one. Whereas some of my best articles certainly are the ones where the reviewers have come back and gone, well, I guess maybe, but have you considered this and this? And of course, you read that and you go, and then well, maybe they have a point, and you end up with a much better thing. But if you're in a hurry because you need this article to be out by the time your book comes out, then you're not going to be so pleased. No, I've certainly seen that happening. I've seen articles that have been seem to have got through peer review remarkably quickly, and it turns out that they were already mentioned in the book that hit the book stands 7 weeks later. Quite interesting. Normally there's a lead time for these things. So yeah, I don't know. It's necessary, I think, but it's definitely hugely insufficient. But I don't have a magic fix for it, because the problem is human nature fundamentally. The problem is that we're all, to different extents, bad actors. Essentially, science would be great if we were all Spock, but we're all Kirk. And that is that's the kind of takeaway, I think. We're not Spock,
That brings up,
but we pretend as a society that our scientists are all Spock.
That's a really good way of summarizing it. That actually prompted me to want to ask, and I think I'll make this the final question. I have noticed if I end up talking with people, because I often can for 2 or 3 hours, people see my videos posted online and they're like, 3 hours? No way, I'm not even going to start. So we got to wrap it up in a more manageable time frame for most people. I guess the average run of a movie. So you mentioned that, and that just leads me to this final question. I didn't even think of this, but what role do you think AI could end up playing in all of this? Because to a certain extent, I mean, maybe it could do something that humans aren't capable of doing. So, I'm thinking of the big buzz right now is ChatGPT in academia, like students using it, people using it to write papers. Do you think that we're going to be dealing with like a very different landscape a few years from now because of the influence of AI on academic work? And if so, any thoughts on where that might take us?
Surely, but initially it will. Even if there is potential there for good things to happen, they do these things where the AI is designing molecules based on how other molecules work. It can churn through if you were to move that carbon bond around to that side of that whatever it is. But that's doing the actual research. In terms of scientific publishing, I don't. What does it even mean if you say, I got AI to write my article? You're going to put your name on it? Hey, I typed the query into ChatGPT. I mean, already we have the problem that scientific articles are very dull and boring to read, except the ones by people like Adam Mastroianni and Edwin Lubin-Piri, who actually write in English, because we all think we have to write in this sort of, totally dead-end style. For the Grimm project, I read 100 articles in JPSP, and after a while, I was kind of, I could. There was like a sort of incantation of a JPSP paper. The AI is not going to come up, I think, with anything spontaneously radically different to that. It's just going to generate more of the same. So in terms of actually producing papers, perhaps it will demonstrate to people the absurdity of producing papers. But what I rather fear is that in 40 years' time, we will still be producing papers and formatting them on PDFs. It's just that we'll be having AIs to write them, and then we'll be having AIs to read them. And it starts becoming, it's like when my answering machine calls for a table for lunch. At some point there has to be a human who wants to get something done. And is it just going to end up all kind of just talking to itself? So I think we've only had the AI hype for like 12, 18 months really. And every time I look at it, someone's taking it in a completely different direction or taking the debate in a completely different direction. So I really don't know. But the impression I have is it's going to make it monumentally difficult to, for example, detect undergraduate cheating. And then I think we have to ask ourselves what our education system is for and what our evaluation system is. Are we going to start having to go back to having far more vivas? Will the universities accept that? Because fundamentally the universities, I don't know if you've been involved in undergraduate marking, but the universities really don't care that much if undergraduates cheat, in my experience. One or two teachers will make a fuss about it, but there are many reasons why undergraduates are non-fireable. Many categories of undergraduate are non-fireable, and this will just, I think, make that problem worse. And I mean, ditto in high school. So do we have to find different ways of assessing learning? That might be nice. That might be nice. Perhaps we're looking for a golden age of oral presentations. But at the moment, I don't see anything terribly positive coming out of that. But I'm an old man, and I don't very often see kind of positive things coming out. In science, because they haven't been corrupted yet, but they will be. They will be. They will get their PhD and need to get a postdoc position if they want to stay in academia. And overwhelmingly, the good people leave. And if I look at the people who I think of as were the leaders of the open science movement in psychology 6 or 7 years ago, the majority of those are no longer in academia. And the system weeds out the original thinkers and the curious and leaves the hacks behind to some extent, as well as some good people, listeners. That means you. But you've got a system that basically selects for compliance and mediocrity. But I think that's true of many things in our society. That they select for mediocrity, and I don't think we should expect academia to be any different. I think perhaps the single biggest takeaway is for people, if you look at academia and say, why does X or Y or Z happen? Say, well, does this happen in the civil service? Does this happen in government? Does this happen in big corporations? Does this happen in the military? Yeah, it happens there too, because those organizations are also made up of people, and there's nothing special about academia or science because it's made up of Kirks and not Spocks. And I think the thing I would like is for people to stop imagining that there's something special about academia and just treat all of the human problems that we see there as to be expected. Within the military, we have the military police, and the military police's job is to do things like stop soldiers who, are disciplined people driving around the base too fast and committing sexual assault and, all kinds of bad stuff. We have the military police. The military do not go, well, of course we wouldn't need police. Our soldiers are trained and highly disciplined. They know that they need police. And in academia, we have this sort of, we're all such good guys. We definitely don't need to be policed in any way, shape, or form. No. Stop treating fraud and misconduct as if it's some kind of meteorite strike that we couldn't possibly have imagined happening, and start treating it as a problem that we need to first quantify, and then we're not going to eliminate it. But if we say, if 10% of people are currently committing fraud, let's set ourselves a target that in 5 years' time, only 8% of people will be committing fraud, because that's how you treat crime and other undesirable behavior in public policy. You don't sort of have a fit of the vapors and go, oh my God, there's a murder. Politicians go, under my watch, murders have gone down 20%. And we go, well, that's not bad, the murder. We don't go, you mean 80 people still got murdered? We go, okay, it went down. We understand that it's an endemic problem and a systematic problem and a permanent problem. Can we move the needle? And at the moment, we don't even think there's a needle.
Well, hopefully we can move the dial down a bit. I think that's a good place to wrap up. So I guess I just want to ask you, if people want to find your work and the kinds of stuff that you do, where can they go to do that?
Well, I could read it out, but then it wouldn't. I'll give you a couple of links to put in the description.
That's what I'll do. Okay, awesome. And then any last things you want to say, and then we'll just close things out, and I'll end the video.
No, thanks for having me on. This has been fascinating. I didn't know anything about you until you first contacted me. I didn't remember that you contacted me 6 years earlier, but I keep all my emails. And I went off and I saw the interview you did with Adam Mastroianni, who, first of all, I was pleased to get to know him a little bit better. And I thought that was a really good interview. I would like to be part of that channel. So I don't know about that's the only one I've seen, but certainly that would be an absolute reference for me. If anybody's watching and they want to, I enjoyed this, what should I look at? Look at the Adam Mastroianni interview. And I hope that this video also gets you views and feedback. And I will give you some contact links.
Awesome. Yeah, I should say, that these two discussions have probably been the greatest divergence from what I do on my channel. I started the channel about a year ago, and I actually mostly talk about a completely unrelated topic, which is meta-ethics, and I talk about moral realism. So I don't even know if that's something you care about or are interested in at all, but it has absolutely nothing to do with this. And I focus so much on that because I just came out of a dissertation. I went to grad school for 2 rounds. I did a philosophy master's, and then I did a PhD in psychology. And I spent 10 years completely invested in that one topic, the meta-ethics, moral realism stuff. And it's all I did for a decade. And I had my channel for about a year, only covering pretty much that with almost no exceptions. And I've found, and I had such a narrow focus. I had some people say, it sounds like you always talk about the same thing. And after about a year of being finished with all the dissertation work, the fog has started to lift, and I'm rediscovering that I care about other things. I care about meta science. I care about all these meta questions. I care about how the systems that I'm involved in operate, and there are other topics. So yeah, these really are different conversations. But yeah, the Adam talk, I love what Adam does. If people don't know or they haven't seen that, I guess I'll mention it here. So Adam runs a blog called Experimental History, and also has a background in psychology, and it's just super cool, and you should check it out. But yeah, cool. So I really appreciate the kind words. I guess we could end it there. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Please like the video if you like the video. If not, I guess dislike it. Honest feedback. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And I will see you all later. Take care.